Hi class, and welcome to another lecture for Social Psychology, Psych 241. Today we're going to go over Chapter 4, which is going to be Social Cognition. Before we begin, though, remember you can stop by office hours, which are Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30 via Zoom, or you can also email me for appointment. Additionally, if you have any other questions, you can shoot me an email. Also, don't forget about the other assignments that are coming up. Make sure you check the syllabus for due dates as well as Blackboard for more details on those. But beyond that, let's go ahead and jump into what we will be talking about today. Our outline for today, we're going to start off by just going over what social cognition is, the basics of this. Then we're going to dig into what schemas are a bit and how they can actually affect our social cognition, right? And by that, we can also talk about the information and our social cognition, which is very, very tightly linked, more than most people realize. The end of class, we're going to talk about heuristics and biases in judgment, some of which we will talk about during this lecture, and a lot of this will also be covered during our synchronous class portion as well to go into a bit more detail. But let's go ahead and begin with the start of this. What is social cognition? Well, social cognition is the ways in which people think about themselves and their social world. So how it is that we think about us, other people, all of this relating to the world in which we live in, including how we deal with the information that we process. What is it that we save? What is it that we throw out? How do we select what we focus on? How do we interpret it? How do we remember it? And how do we use it? All of which is not a straightforward answer when we talk about social cognition. So thinking about how the world works and how we make sense of it. Right, so how is it that we make sense of the world we live in? Are we making sense of it in a way that's biased, unbiased? We talk about how we perceive each other people in different events, some of which, right, some people can describe as great, other people can describe as bad. It's the same event. How does this happen? Well, we don't just think about this in terms of how we make sense of this, but just even like what is it that we pay attention to and what do we do with all of this information? All of these are questions that we have to understand in order to better understand how we work. We're not just input, output, right? Information comes in from neurons and it goes up to our head and goes back out. We interpret that information. We use other information we have, whether it be current relevant information, things we know about from our memories, things we know about from stereotyping or our culture. And all of this helps us understand how we think. So with that in general, we can think about how we act as people in one of two ways. We can think about humans as what we call naive scientists, or what we call cognitive misers. Naive scientists, what we mean by that is that people often act as untrained or naive scientists when we look at things or we try to objectively and make accurate judgments. So, for instance, if I am trying to figure out why I don't feel good this week, maybe I try to change some of the things I eat, change my diet, change my sleep pattern, and see if that gives me any indication on whether I'm sleeping better or worse or feeling better or worse. And that's technically a scientific experiment, or it's in some way, shape, or form, right, where we're manipulating variables and trying to make accurate judgments. So maybe I shouldn't eat all this fried food tonight. Maybe I shouldn't drink so much I get hungover. These are things in which we are trying to understand the world around us. But on the other hand, we also don't like to do a ton of information, do that too often. That's a lot of information to process. And we are what we call cognitive misers in the sense that in terms of our cognitions, our thought patterns, we tend to be stingy about using them. We don't want to think too much if we don't have to. It expends energy. So we try to use a minimal amount of energy in order to make social judgments, among other things. But we're going to talk a lot about social judgments today. So when we talk about being cognitive misers, one way you can think about this is in when we call this parallel processing model, what we call automatic processing, whereas we also have this controlled processing that takes more effort. And automatic processing is going to be quick and, like we said, automatic thinking. This is what goes on without necessarily conscious deliberation. This is very efficient, right? one example I always like to use is if you've ever bumped into something and said "ow" before you've realized if it hurts or not. That is an example of automatic processing. Or if you, as the book says, if you're driving somewhere but you're daydreaming, right? You're not consciously doing these things, but maybe you've gotten right halfway to wherever you're going and go, "Oh, what was I? How did I get here?" Right? Did I run red lights? Why am I here? Well, your non-conscious mind or the non-conscious portion of your mind is doing a lot of decision making here and doing a lot of work without you even needing to think about it. However, our controlled processing is a very useful tool. This is effortful and deliberative. This we have to take time to do. Right? We maybe think carefully before making a decision, and this is going to be much more accurate than our automatic processing. So when we look at these two, automatic processing is very quick. It goes, it happens without effort. Versus controlled processing is an extremely slow type of process. Well, comparatively, it's much slower because you are going through the options and weighing things more than others, right? An example of an automatic process would be, for instance, if I grabbed two writing utensils, we'll call them a pen and a pencil, and I just said, "Hey, right? You say, I forgot something to write with today. Can I borrow something?" I said, "Yeah, here's a pen or a pencil, whatever one you want." Now, if you just go like whatever, grab one, that's going to be automatic processing. But if you sit there and take some time to be like, "Well, I usually write in pen, but that pen doesn't look right," and you start weighing the pros and cons of these things. That's going to be more controlled processing. Automatic processes are based on associations, or what we can call schemas, which we'll talk about in a bit. Whereas instead of being based on schemas, controlled processing is using rules, or more or less kind of like following step-by-step instructions. So if-then statements. So if somebody asks, "How are you?" then you say "good," right? Versus maybe our more automatic processing, it's just we don't even think about that. Automatic processing can be done in parallel, as they call it. So things happen at the same time. While we are talking to somebody and driving, right, we are able to do actions outside of what we are totally consciously aware of, and we can do these at the same time. However, controlled processing is done serially with an S. Serial starts with an S. Serially meaning one at a time. So before we do the next step, we have to go through this step. Whereas automatic process is effortless, controlled processing is going to be effortful and deliberate. So when we think of these, automatic processing we can think of in terms of three I words, that it's impulsive, intuitive, and immediate. Right? So it happens really quick without thinking. It goes with what we call intuitive judgment. So we don't have to spend a lot of time knowing. We just kind of go with our gut, and it's immediate because it's very, very quick. Controlled processing, on the other hand, has some R words with it. Reasoned, right? We're taking our time thinking through these. Rational, we are not using intuition, we are using logic. And reflective, we're actually thinking about this. So in this first example, we have this idea of a guy here explaining his math problem, right? So some stuff happens and then a miracle occurs, right? This automatic processing here is just kind of we're taking a shortcut, right? Whereas a controlled process might be a little bit larger. And when we think how this works, right, we have two pathways we can take. So as you saw with my nice little animation there, we have a stimulus that appears before us. Maybe that's a thought, maybe it's a question or a decision that we have to make. Say that somebody walks up to you and says, "Hi, I'm lost, can you help me?" Well, you can figure out what to do in one of two ways. You can think impulsively and go through an automatic set of processes, right? Whatever seems normal, whatever seems right in the moment, and that will give you a behavior. However, we can also take this upper path, which I have dotted because it's not necessarily the path we always choose. It's less used and we have to actively try to do this. And it would be reflective. So maybe you think, why is this person approaching me, right? And there might be good reasons to think more reflectively. So it's one thing if somebody asks you on a college campus, right, "Hey, I'm lost, can you help me?" It's another thing if, say, you are abroad and people keep walking up to you asking for help. It's like, Are you trying to pickpocket me? Is there something else going on? And there might be a better reason to think about this. So social cognition relies on these two types of thinking, this automatic versus controlled thinking. And throughout what we talk about, remember this is one of the most important things from psychology, is social psychology in particular, is understanding that we as people try to be quick and efficient with our judgments. We don't like to use controlled processing unless we need to, right? Who should I marry? What car should I buy? What school should I go to? But things that are lower stakes, what cereal do I want to eat? I don't really spend too much time thinking about that. But what meal do I want to make for my significant other's parents? That one, we probably want to take some more time and really think about. So recognizing that these two types of thinking are both useful for specific things, but we will also talk more about that later. But do remember that automatic processing, you're not as likely to get a correct answer with than controlled processing. Now, most of the time you'll be right, but not always. Now let's turn our attention to schemas, and hopefully you know what schemas are, right? Like to hope, but what is a schema? A schema can be described as a mental structure that organizes our knowledge about the world around us. Specifically, when we talk about schemas in social, we talk about these as our social world around us. We talked in the last chapter about how we have self-schemas. We have our organization and our knowledge about who we are, which hopefully is accurate, but doesn't always have to be. If you're a narcissistic person, you have a schema about yourself saying you're really great. Maybe that's different than what's actually happening. A great way to think about schemas is try to think about almost like, I like to think about like tags in a YouTube video or things, the kind of related words on a PowerPoint, or a research article. And think about like what comes to mind when you think of a fast food restaurant. You might think about how it's cheap, how it's usually part of a chain. It's fattening food and it's probably tasty. Now, you can also think of a different example, something like college courses, right? With college courses, you might have very specific knowledge or beliefs about what a college class should look like. So you probably think it's about 20 or more, give or take, students, some academic topics. Maybe there's exams. Instead, it might be a paper class and hopefully awesome instructors. But the idea is that if we look at what it is that's related to these things, we have an egg, for instance, in this one. This is a great example of a schema. And so if you think, what are things related to an egg, right? Maybe that a bird makes it, right? Hens, that we find it in a supermarket, that they're different sizes, different colors, we can eat them, all these things that are related to them, maybe more or less, but helps us to make sense of our world around us. And we also know that, other things make eggs, but probably what people think of at first is chicken eggs. However, lots of animals make eggs. But why are these useful other than helping us understand our world? Well, they, one, can act as what we call scripts. So again, they could be an automatic way we just think about the world, or we can pull on some knowledge for how we think we should act in a situation. So, if you're going on a date, you might pull from that knowledge about what is a good idea for a date. Probably going something like ice skating or going to get food instead of, I can't even think of a good bad example anymore. Probably don't get close to each other now, but nonetheless. You can also think about schemas working as stereotypes. Schemas, again, are just organizational knowledge. And if we saw some of these people up here, we might think that they are jocks. We don't know how smart they are. We just know that they look very buff. The guy in the middle maybe isn't as much of a jock as other people. And as we talked about briefly before, we can talk about self-schemas. So generalizations or beliefs about who we are and how we organize that information and process it within ourselves. Now imagine how important that is if you are somebody who's depressed and you are looking at your self-schema through this depressed lens. You might be more focused on the fact that you can't do anything right, or have low self-esteem, feel down, instead of looking at it through maybe a clearer lens. So with schemas, when we do something, we want to use the most accessible schemas to us. We want to use the ones that make the most sense. And by adulthood, we've encountered most of the situations we're going to see in our life before. right? So even if it's a new situation, you can usually compare it to some other relevant example in your life and apply relevant schemas, right? So the instance I have here is that if you walk into a new classroom that you've never seen before, it's not like you've walked into something totally different. Just in the same way that if you finish college, your first day of work is probably going to be a little bit similar to your first day of class in some ways. And you can imagine how going on a date with somebody is going to be familiar with going, or, similar to going on dates with other people. But the main thing is just, why would we ignore our relevant information when it's, most of the times it's almost identical? Because usually it's a great idea, but sometimes, right, you might try to use a schema that doesn't necessarily work, and that can cause some issues. But the idea behind this is, as long as we are looking at the things that we're doing, and we are going with what we maybe say is our gut and what we're kind of used to in this situation, we're going to be using schemas correctly. Now, schemas do a lot of different things. And one way to think about this is in terms of these 4 things. We've already gone over the first one, but I think it's worth talking about the next 3 in a bit more specificity each. Schemas organize incoming knowledge to make sense of the world. But not only that, but they affect the attention we give to certain things, our storage, and our recall of information. So things related to memory. So we might not pay attention to certain things. We might not store or remember certain things, or we might forget to recall or not be able to recall certain things based on its usefulness and our understanding of a certain schema, which we'll get into more information on, or more detail in a moment. We can also talk about how this affects the interpretation of behavior. And so not just what we see, but how we interpret how it works. So with moving on to this kind of memory aspect of this affecting attention, storage, and recall, we know that attention is what we call a limited resource. We can't pay attention to everything going on at once, right? We take in gigabytes of information a day, right? What we feel, what we sense, what we see. And we automatically allocate attention to relevant stimuli and ignore irrelevant stimuli. So if you are walking around, as I do in the morning, I take my dog to the dog park. Currently, I go to a dog park that is apparently in the middle of like a mosquito infestation right now. So while I don't pay attention to the feelings I get on my body when the wind blows on my hand, I do pay attention when I feel, right, a little bit of a mosquito's legs kind of flutter alongside me. And so all of that information that I'm paying attention to, it's at the cost of ignoring other information. When you're sitting here, you probably don't feel your shirt right now sitting on your body, but when I draw your attention to it, you can feel how it sits on your body. You might have to move it around, kind of habituation in a sense in terms of our sensations. But when we think about how this looks, we can call this the bottleneck theory of attention, so that we have all these sensory inputs coming in at us, but we can only deal with a certain number, and that is kind of a bottleneck for us. So one thing we have to do is recognize what is relevant and what is irrelevant. What should we be paying attention to and what should we not be paying attention to? At a cocktail party, we probably don't need to be paying attention to everyone else's conversation, but if we hear our name, we ought to attend to that and pay attention to it. So while schemas can affect attention, they can also affect storage and memory. They can actually lead to what we call false remembering, or this idea that we might include schema-consistent information as part of your memory of an interaction. So what do we mean by that? So our memories are fallible. They're pretty bad, to be quite honest. We don't necessarily remember things like a camera. What we do is we remember details, and we remember the majority of things, and we try to fill in the rest. For instance, to get to my class, or to get to somewhere in your life, you've likely had to walk up some stairs, or take an elevator, or what have you. My question for you is, to get to my class if you've come, or to get to home, or to some building that you frequent, you probably have to walk up some stairs. How many stairs do you have to walk up? Well, I I know in Flagler, if you go through the back hallway to get up to the third floor, the stairs are kind of in a square kind of spiral upwards. I don't know how many stairs there are. I mean, I walk it every day, but I'm not sure. So I would guess that maybe, right, there's 4 or 5 stairs before a turn, then another 3, then another 4. So that many stairs, give or take. Well, what I'm doing is I am including schema consistent information with part of my memory of this. I don't know it for sure, but I'm pretty sure there are stairs there and it's not some flat or ramped surface. I know that, but I don't remember how many stairs. So I am filling in information here, and I could theoretically be falsely remembering things if I am screwing up my schemas. Now, this doesn't happen often, right? Things that are completely schema inconsistent, right? You're not going to forget, right? We don't think of Santa as being somebody who chills out on the beach all the time. We know Santa is up in the North Pole. But when we think about Disney, one thing you can ask people, and they did this in a study, was they asked people, hey, do you remember seeing Daffy Duck in a video about Disney World or Disneyland, whichever one? A lot of people, I believe the majority of people said, yes, I remember seeing Daffy Duck. Daffy Duck is not the guy on the screen. Daffy Duck is the black duck. You probably know him from being with Bugs Bunny, but this is Donald Duck, I believe. Oh my goodness, I just looked it up and I screwed those up. Those are backwards. So this guy right here is Donald Duck. And the other guy is Daffy Duck. Maybe I said that right. I can't remember. Anyways, swiftly moving on from that point, the thing to recognize is that we can actually cause false memories if it makes sense to our schema. And we don't necessarily always remember details clearly. And so we kind of fill in the gaps with what seems to make sense. Right? You may not remember what exactly the cars were that passed you on your drive home today, or whenever you were driving. But you do remember that there were cars that passed you, there were other people on the road. So recognizing that your memory is filling in these gaps. And when we think about this, one thing we do is we focus on different things. Specifically, our brain is much better at remembering the things at either the beginning of a list, a story, a class, things of this sort, or at the end, of whatever it might be. And when we can remember things well at the beginning, we call this the primacy effect, Like prime meaning first, prime minister being the first minister, where recency, it's what is most recent, and we also remember that. So with all of this knowledge, one thing we can do, and one thing we're really bad at, is fully noticing what is going on. A lot of times we just kind of hand wave and go, sure, that's good, And one thing we can talk about is confirmation bias, and another is selective attention. The first thing we'll talk about is confirmation bias here, and the idea that we are often on the lookout for what confirms our schemas. We pay attention to things that fit our narrative of the world, If we think that Stetson is a good school, we are going to seek out information and tend to notice and remember things about how Stetson's a good school. If we see comments about how Stetson's not a good school, or we see a news article that says Stetson's not doing well in this, that, or the other, we're more likely to forget we even saw that because it doesn't fit with what we know about and what we believe about Stetson. And 2, we might also just kind of ignore it specifically because we think it's not that useful. And we'll spend some time talking about that when we talk about persuasion. But this is what we call confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is this idea that we are biased to find information that confirms whatever we say. So if I say vaccines cause autism and you say no, they don't, I am going to look for whatever the first link that proves my point on Google is and use it against you, Because this is a fast, easy way to get something and tell us what we want to hear, even if it's not correct. But another thing we can do is we can talk about selective attention. So we only pay attention to the things we need to. And I don't know if any of you have noticed, but I switched my shirt earlier on in the lecture. And likely many of you didn't actually catch that. That is going to be a very clear instance of selective attention. You did not notice when I made this change, when I selectively changed this aspect, right? I'm only paying attention to certain things. In the same way, my dog has selective hearing, where she only hears certain things I tell her. We have selective attention. We only pay attention to certain things, and we know to tune others out. And what's the consequence of this? Well, we remember schema-consistent information better than schema-inconsistent information. Mostly, right? And that makes sense, because if it goes along with what we think it should be, we're going to agree with it. But there is a caveat. So unless the schema you're looking at has something that's really inconsistent going on, that's something that's going to be remembered really well. So think about it this way. If you saw me on campus, right, that's not really that unique, right? That's pretty consistent with your belief about me. If you saw me walking down the hall in the psych building, well, he's a professor, he works here. Now, if you saw me getting absolutely plastered out at a bar on a Saturday night, that is likely not in your schema of me. That is something that you are going to be like, whoa, I'm definitely going to remember that, even though that's something completely outside of what I expected, solely for the fact that it is outside what I expected of Professor Dickey. So recognizing that if it makes sense to if it makes sense to keep that information because it fits with what we know, we're going to keep it. And what we don't, we're going to toss unless it's so incredibly different, right? If you know somebody who's just an incredibly nice person every day, you might not remember the days that maybe they're a little grumpy, but you are going to remember the day that they snap at the waitress at a restaurant, right? Where it's so heavily inconsistent with your beliefs about that person that you really are like, well, okay, I'm not going to forget that. A good study talking about this was by Cohen in 1981, in which he took a videotape of a couple or two people he had come into the lab having dinner. And it was a woman and her husband, and what they did was they told half of the participants that the woman was a librarian, and the other half that the woman was a waitress. And so they showed them this video of this woman and man having dinner, and all they did was change what people were told ahead of time, right? You're going to watch this woman who's a librarian, or you're going to watch this woman who is a waitress. Now, she did a variety of different behaviors and talked about a lot of different things throughout her dinner with her husband, some of which were on the left here. Left for all of us, yes. Plays piano, right? She talked about how she plays piano. She wore glasses. She wasn't very affectionate towards this person, her husband, apparently. They sat at a nice formal dinner table, or so this is where I get confused, is I think half of the table was very formal, or parts of the table were very formal, but another part of the table maybe had some junk on it, or other things that maybe aren't as formal. And then I believe there was a television in the back, and some people, when they believed she was a librarian, which these traits kind of fall under, didn't recall the television. But when they were told that this woman was a waitress, they remembered things about her drinking beer, spending the day working, about listening to pop music. They remembered this table not being as formal, and they remembered seeing a television. And really, this was just a memory test, right? They were told, just remember these details. And what do we find? People have a better memory for schema-consistent versus schema-inconsistent information. Now, none of this information is so inconsistent, right, that you're just completely shocked into remembering it. But you're only going to remember the things that fit with what you know. So when we look at this, we find this pattern over time as well. Is that when we look at what people remembered immediately after the video, 4 days after the video, and 7 days after the video, our information went down, but people still remembered consistent info more than inconsistent info. So that's really going to be important to recognize that not only does this make us focus on specific information, it doesn't necessarily make us remember the information that's truly what we saw. We kind of just go about with what we think we saw. Something I think is really interesting. Moving on to how schemas affect interpretation of information. So it's not only our memory and our ability to watch and see this information, but how does this affect our interpretation of our memory? And one thing to recognize is that only accessible schemas influence our interpretation. So only the schemas we are thinking about. So this is why, if, for instance, I ask people, what is the opposite of red? If you are primed, as we would call it, to be thinking about painting or colors in general, most often people will say the opposite of red is blue. But if I am talking about traffic or cars, and I say, what's the opposite of red? The accessible schema is a traffic light, is a red light. And that the opposite of a red light is a green light, whereas the opposite of red paint, people often think of blue paint. So recognizing that this actually influences how we interpret information, not just what we're thinking about too. So what makes a schema accessible? Well, one thing is its chronic accessibility. Another might be its goal-related accessibility. So is this something you're thinking about a lot of the time? Or is this something that you are thinking about in order to reach a goal? So we can also not only think about what we are constantly thinking about, right? So if you're an alcoholic, you might be thinking a lot about alcohol, but we can also temporarily prime people, and we can change those primes. And what happens, though, is we can have what we call selective interpretation. And selective interpretation is, as it says, we can interpret our information that we see differently. So say you are a chronic alcoholic, right? You are somebody who has a chronic accessibility to drinking. Versus another person who has a goal-related accessibility of studying for the MCAT. Right? They want to be a doctor, and so they're very focused on this kind of medical information. And they see this picture down here. Well, what are people going to interpret? I would guess that the alcoholic, the guy in the picture over here, is going to look at these people and say, wow, they look pretty drunk. Whereas maybe the person with the MCAT, studying for the MCAT, is going to look at these people and say, wow, they look really sick. And so looking at this piece of information, and by that we mean the picture down here, depending on what is going on in your mind, that's going to influence and going to change how we interpret this information. Now, that's a really interesting question, because what happens when we are not sure? So say, for instance, you watch a scary movie at home alone, and then you hear a knock on the door. Well, what are you going to think it is? What's the first thing that's going to come to your mind? It's probably the idea that it's going to be whoever that scary bad guy was from your movie, right? Definitely not that it's going to be the pizza man who you ordered pizza from an hour ago. The idea behind that is it's a great example of how this ambiguous information, the knock could be anything. But we take it with what is relevant to the schema that is accessible right now. And the schema that's accessible right now is likely the fact that, we just watched a scary movie. Now, if, for instance, I thought about the food I was going to eat here whenever the pizza guy got here, and then I heard a knock on the door, my immediate thought is probably going to jump to, hey, it's the pizza guy, right? Because that is what is most accessible and most consistent with the schema that is accessible to me at this point. Another study that looked at this was the Donald study, which your book talks about. So in the first study, they claim this was a two-part study. And in the first study, participants were primed with different words. And this was really just a cover task in order to prime participants with these words. They were asked to memorize certain words, including the two different sets below. So one set of words was adventurous, independent, persistent, self-confident, whereas the other set of words was reckless, aloof, stubborn, conceited. Afterwards, participants read about Donald and evaluated him. And so what you see is that they rate Donald higher on traits that are consistent with the prime. So for the people who formed positive impressions of Donald by having these words up here, right, adventurous, independent, persistent, self-confident, they saw Donald as a much more positive person. Whereas people who read words like reckless, aloof, stubborn, and conceited, actually, we see the reverse effect. We see them much more likely to form a negative impression of Donald. And now one thing I want to note with this, and pay attention to this, is that what are the difference between the top and the bottom words for each one? Adventurous is one way to describe somebody outside, right? Maybe climbing a mountain. Reckless is also a way to describe somebody climbing a mountain. Independent and aloof are very similar words, with one a positive and one a negative connotation. Being persistent, isn't that just being stubborn, right, to somebody who doesn't like you? And then being self-confident, having some decent amount of self-confidence, versus being conceited. That's almost a personal opinion difference. And so just by looking at these words that mean the same thing, more or less, one with a positive or negative connotation, we will form different opinions about people. How do you think this matters when we come into a bad mood when we meet somebody? We're not going to like them as much because that's going to be consistent with what we are thinking in our head. So it's important to recognize how schemas affect our interpretation as well, not just the activation, storage, and retrieval of memory. Additionally, the last thing we'll talk about with schemas is they guide our behavior. And all of this makes sense. Given what we've talked about already, all of this kind of comes together, where our accessible schemas influence our interpretation of information, and that impacts what we decide to do with that. So in this last study, we've interpreted Donald as, hopefully a nice guy if we got positive words. So my question is, how are you going to act when you meet Donald? You're probably going to like him more than if you read those words where you didn't like, probably didn't form a positive impression of him. And so we can see this in priming studies, and we'll talk about the shooter studies as well as self-fulfilling prophecies. So before we get into all of these, one thing we can talk about is some pretty interesting findings in social psychology. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you pretend you're a parent. So pretend you're a parent and you get this excuse from a high schooler, right? I did poorly on my test because I was reading Cosmo, right? Models, stupid. That's the quote, not me. Right? Having stupid on the brain made me act stupidly. If my kid told me that, I would be like, are you out of your mind? No way. How about this one? Dad, I was past curfew, I know, but it was only because the store clerk was really old. And I couldn't help but imagine how slow old people were. And so that must have made me drive home slower. Yeah, okay, you're still grounded, buddy. As lame as these excuses sound, each of them has empirical support that they do work. Can the mere presence of a professor make you smarter? Well, yeah. How does this work? Well, half the participants imagine the life of a professor, and this was considered the smart condition. The other half imagined the life of supermodels, which was considered they claimed the dumb condition. And then all participants, after imagining what the life of each one of these people were like, or what one of these people were like, were just asked to do a general knowledge test. And out of 20 possible questions, there was a significant difference for those who were in the condition imagining a professor. What does this mean? It means that we can be primed by other people. So somebody who does, we would believe is a smart person might help us be more smart just by thinking how, imagining their life and maybe thinking how they would think. We can also see other research, Some research has found that being exposed to words such as gray, Florida, elderly, and old decreases memory capacity in college students. So elderly people might be a little less cognitively active, and so thinking about how an elderly person thinks might activate the schema of how an elderly person thinks to you, and that might influence how you interpret this information. And the idea is just generally that thinking of smart can prime smart behaviors. And this can make you smart. Crazy. It's really, really strange. But why does it work? Well, it's two ways we can think of this. The first one is semantic priming. So we can semantically relate words to facilitate the action of one another. So when we think of the word egg, you can think of whatever comes to mind. Another example is actually a lie, because I don't have another example. Oh my goodness. That was not my PowerPoint, but there it is again. So semantic priming, right? Semantic meaning related to words, is that words can facilitate the action of one another, or the activation, excuse me, but we can also talk about behavioral priming. So priming certain concepts may actually initiate behavior that is compatible with a concept. So one thing is maybe if we see, right, be happy, like, hey, you should smile, right? Or like, probably not the smile you're on camera, but like, like smile, have a nice day, like something like that might make you more happy. And so that is, again, an example of that Dijkster-House study that we just talked about regarding a professor versus a model. But another study that I want to spend some good amount of time talking about in class and online, so you probably should be listening for this part, is what we call the shooter bias study. And this study came about due to a man back couple years, probably over a decade plus ago, a young 23-year-old immigrant from Guinea who was shot 41 times after holding a wallet. His name was Amadou Diallo. And Coral Park, Judd, and Wittenbrink came out with this study that has been very impactful in social psychology. It's been repeated many times. We know it to be a very valid study. And what it is really just looking at what kind of schemas do people have about African Americans versus white Americans regarding guns and violence generally. So what they did was they brought people into their lab and they showed them pictures like this. And they differed the pictures in two different dimensions. So there were two independent variables. The first independent variable was the race of the assailant, or we would call them, right? The bad guy that you either have to shoot or not shoot. And all they did was manipulate whether that was a white person or a black person. So we have one independent variable, white versus black target. And then all of the models, so everyone in this photo, in the photos, as you can see here, was carrying an object. And what they did is they differentiated that. Was the person holding a wallet or a gun? Been really crazy if I just pulled out a gun. But right, so is this person holding something like, right, a dark object that could be a gun versus an actual gun? And so what they wanted to see was, out of 20 trials, how many errors did you make? So how many times did you shoot when you weren't supposed to? And how many times did you not shoot when you were supposed to? Right? So if somebody has a gun and you don't shoot them, that's an error. If somebody doesn't have a gun and you do shoot them, that is also an error. So for each trial, you can screw up. And they counted how many times people screwed up and in which conditions. So is it for certain races? Is it for certain objects? What is it? Well, when we look at white targets, so a white person in the video, the picture, whatever it might be, with the armed targets, they accidentally did not shoot white targets approximately a little over 2 times out of 20 on average. On white targets, they did shoot on accident, just again, a little over 2 times on average. So what we see here is that when the target is armed, about 17.5% of time, or out of 20 times, we're going to get it right. When it's a white man with a gun. When it's a white man with a wallet, we're going to accidentally shoot him about, a little over 2 times out of 20. Now, with African Americans, we see a very different pattern. So the number of errors, the number of missed shots for an armed black target was less than 1.5 out of 20 on average. So this means that the number of errors people made in shooting an armed black man was very low. People were very good at recognizing and choosing to shoot an armed black man. But were they as good at recognizing and choosing not to shoot an unarmed black man? No. Not at all. And that's really scary. That difference is enormous in social psychological research, right? This is, right, if we were to take this statistically, that, 3 out of 20 times that this situation happens, people, we're talking law enforcement who have taken this, undergraduate students who have taken this, graduate students who have taken this, random people from our population. This is a common study that has been repeated again over and over. We find very similar things. Why is this happening when we think of schemas? I want us to be able to talk about that hint for a while in class next week. So recognizing what is going on here, why? Okay, so enough about that. The next thing we'll move on to is self-fulfilling prophecies. And self-fulfilling prophecies are this idea about how we might think that someone or something is causing something that is going to make it actually true. So we're going to act in a way that's consistent with a belief, right? And then we are probably going to, with that stereotypical behavior, cause that to happen. So if I think that my shirt is a lucky shirt, say, I'm going to feel confident today. Great. What happens if you feel confident? Well, we know people tend to do better if they feel confident about themselves. So by wearing my lucky shirt, I'm really just giving myself a boost of confidence that then I later think is because my shirt is lucky. So one way to think about this, right, is, say you have an expectancy about somebody. So say you see somebody coming up and to talk to you, and you don't necessarily like them, right? You have, maybe somebody told you, hey, you're going to have to meet Bob, and Bob's kind of a jerk, but whatever. And so you think about Bob, and you're like, is Bob a nice guy or not? Well, no, I don't like him. He's a snob. And so when you, right, go to talk to Bob, you're probably going to treat him like a snob. And whether or not Bob the snob is a snob or not, that is going to affect how he perceives you. So if he's not a snob, right, he's going to be like, wow, okay, why are you treating me like a snob? I don't like you. And now all of a sudden you go, see, he is a snob. Because what's happening is we are setting ourselves up for failure. Self-fulfilling prophecy. We have a prophecy. I'm going to do bad on an exam. Right? So say we have a schema. If I don't study, I'm going to do bad on an exam. So I don't say, right, I'm not good at being a student, so I'm going to fail my exam. What am I going to do to act consistently with that belief I'm going to fail my exam? I'm not going to study. And that's going to, right, be a stereotypical action or behavior, and that's going to confirm our expectations when we get a bad grade back. And then, hey, see, I am a bad student to begin with. Now, our schema is even stronger. And you can imagine how this works both ways. It's a downward spiral and an upward spiral, but something you can change. So with self-fulfilling prophecies, one study we can talk about is what we call the Bloomer study. And the Bloomer study was a class of first and second graders who were randomly divided in half. This was, again, kind of in the same way I randomly assigned students to be in one versus the other section. It wasn't based on where they were sitting or anything like that. So what these psychologists did was they took these classes and they took the rosters, divided them in half, and they took half of the roster and said, these kids, who we're just called being in Group A, these are the students that we have expected as psychologists to bloom this year or do really, really well. However, we also have this group of students, this Group B, who we think is going to fail. They're not going to do as well this year. And so they got a baseline IQ measure of these students, and then they checked their IQ at the end of the year. Now, we know IQ kind of goes up linearly until you hit adulthood based on certain IQ tests and what you'd expect. But not only this, but right, we would expect students who are expected to do well, and I should just say, let me clarify this. Only the teacher was told who would do well or not. The students were not, the parents were not, just the teacher. The teacher is the only person other than the experimenters who knows this. And what you find here is that for the other students, the students who are not going to be the bloomers, a lot of them had an IQ increase generally. Actually, just about everybody had an IQ increase as we expect, but it was mostly, right, about 10 points gained. Well, how about the bloomers, right? The ones who the teacher said the teacher thought were going to do good based on some information they had, which wasn't true. These kids did even better. That's crazy. That's kind of a put your mind to it thing, right? Is that if we use this self-fulfilling prophecy, I'm going to succeed as long as I keep trying to succeed, that's going to help us succeed. But how does this work with other people talking about us? Well, the teacher has an expectation about us, right? The teacher has a schema about how we are going to do. If the teacher thinks I'm a bad student, then I'm not going to do well this year, right? The teacher's probably going to give, right, less feedback, less performance opportunities, maybe, right, not be as positive towards me in terms of the social climate. And that's going to lead to poor performance because I don't think they care about me, or, I'm just not getting as much attention as other people. Now, if the teacher thinks I'm going to do good, they might give me a more positive social climate. They might act more warmly towards me, and they might provide more feedback, give me more opportunities to work on my skills, present my skills to the class, and that's going to lead to good performance, which is going to, again, feed back into the fact that the teacher thinks I'm good versus the teacher thinks I'm bad. And all of this stuff is something we can actually measure and find out that this can increase a student's IQ as if you think they're going to do it or do well. And it's going to increase their IQ further if you think they're going to do well. But beyond schemas, we've talked about them for a while, we can talk about information and social cognition, how we deal with this information. And one thing we do is we look at what we call framing effects, or how we frame information. So in which order do we present information? How do we display it? How do we show it off? And how we do that very much influences how it's processed. And honestly, if we just give different answers to the same problem, we can find differences. This is a very famous paper by Kahneman and Tversky, who actually won a Nobel Prize based on some of this work. And what we see is that of these two types of yogurts here, we see that people prefer the 80% fat-free yogurt to the yogurt that contains 20% fat. What's the difference? Each of them contains 20% fat, right? What's the difference between a cup being 2/3 empty and 1/3 full? It's the same. They're the exact same. But how we frame them matters. Another thing we can talk about in terms of information is what we call construal level. And construal level is this idea that we construe or we understand information at different levels. So a good example of this is we also see things at different levels of detail, right? If you're looking way off in the distance at a field of flowers, it all just kind of merges together. But if you're right up close to these flowers, you see everything about them. You see very much detail. And we also have this relationship between what we call temporal or time, as well time, like distances in time, distances in physical space as well, and what we call abstract or concrete thinking. And abstract thinking is thinking about these things in a manner that is more, what's the word I want to say here? More kind of less, let me think. We can think about this in more of like a way that things aren't physically present, or we can't see them, or we can't touch them, where when we think about buildings, structures, this could be something like anything from a shed to a lighthouse to a skyscraper, right? But we can also think about concrete examples of buildings, right? We can think about your friend's Henrietta's house. We can think about what my bathroom or your bathroom looks like, and very specific things that are related to buildings too. But that one is more mentally present, we could say, is you know it better, versus think of something thinking of something very broad, like a boat. Like thinking of a boat is going to draw probably a picture of a boat in your mind, but it doesn't necessarily have a lot of details. So thinking about things in kind of distant terms is going to lead to a lot less detail versus thinking about things in concrete terms. And we see this mirrored in the way that we think about abstract and concrete terms. So distance, when we talk about psychological distance, whether that be temporal distance, physical distance, or just things being further away in our minds, these are thought about in abstract terms, versus psychologically close actions are thought about in concrete terms. Now, a great example to make a lot of sense of this is think about that. Imagine you're going to go on vacation in a year or so from now. So you might think about that vacation now, and you might think where you're going to go. You might think about sitting on the beach. You might think about relaxing, right? Those are pretty abstract thoughts, right? You're not thinking about the very minute, specific detail. But how about when that distance, that time distance, temporal distance closes, and you're going to go tomorrow, right? Your trip is all of a sudden tomorrow, and now you're thinking, did I pack a toothbrush? Where are my sandals? Where can I find my swim trunks? Do we have sunscreen? Is it the right kind of sunscreen? Those are thought about in more concrete terms. They're more specific. They're more relevant to the things that are going on around us as well. So recognizing these differences is going to be a huge thing, and it's a very important thing to understand, because as cognitive misers, we don't want to spend a lot of energy thinking about things like, what sunscreen should I pack a year in advance? We want to think about that when we need to. Okay, so the last set of things we're going to do is talk about heuristics and biases in social judgment. And as we've talked about before, we have automatic versus controlled processing. And automatic processing is going to be this effortless type of processing that happens right immediately, whereas our controlled processing is effortful processing that takes a lot of time to do, but is going to be generally more useful for us because we're definitely going to get a better answer from using that. But it does cost mental energy. So I've accidentally flipped these, so I apologize, but controlled processing are what we call algorithms, right? And algorithms are what we consider to be step-by-step approaches to problem solving. So we follow steps to reach a conclusion. So if we want to bake a cake, we go through each step as it needs to do. If we forget our PIN for our phone, or for our bank, what we could do is we could follow a step-by-step procedure. We could start at 0000. Try that. Okay, it didn't work. 0001. Okay, that didn't work. Try again. 0002. A kind of brute force method. Now, if we do that, we're going to get the right answer, assuming we don't get locked out of our phone or whatever. But it's going to take some time. So what we might do is what we call a heuristic. We might take a time-saving mental shortcut that makes a quick judgment. So we might use insight to figure out the answer. So what could my PIN be? Well, it's not 0000. It's not going to start that way. Right? Well, I usually use my birthday, say. I don't. Not that you know it, right? But right, I usually use my birthday as my PIN. Maybe I should try that one first. And you better hope that your birthday isn't I guess, I don't know, I guess if you put your birthday backwards, you could get up to 9,000. Anyways, the point being here is that if we maybe do some thinking, pull some intuition, we don't have to go through all the steps of doing this, but we can make it a little bit quicker. So we can use judgmental heuristics. So these shortcuts for making judgments quickly and efficiently. So we want to be able to make our decisions as quickly and as easily as possible. And we oftentimes value quickness over perfection because 99% of the time we can be right. So we'll talk about a couple different judgmental heuristics, including the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, the availability heuristic, as well as the representative heuristic. So starting off with these, the anchoring and adjustment heuristic is basically the idea that for numbers and some other things, when we hear a number before we even hear the numbers that we're trying to figure out, we kind of anchor to it. So imagine, for instance, that you are trying to buy a new car and you're not really sure how much you're going to spend. So maybe you say, it's probably going to be, you hear the salesperson say, it's probably going to be about $35,000. That first number is going to stick in your head, even if you are looking differently at different price ranges. It's kind of an anchor. It forces you there. And these are going to bias what your next number you choose is. So, if you hear that it's like, well, most new cars are about $30,000, but this one's $25,000, you're going to be like, oh, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good price. But if you are anchored to the number 20,000 and somebody says 25,000, the same number as before, you're going to be like, oh, that's a lot more than I expected. Right? And so understanding that these random numbers, can't or are very actually powerful, and they kind of bias our judgment, right? So anchors aren't always relevant. So, if you heard that there were 33 states in 1860, how long is the Mississippi River? That's not going to help you. But if I said, for instance, the Colorado River is 500 miles long, how long is the Mississippi River? Well, that 500 number is about something relevant. So you might say, Colorado River is 500. Maybe it's more like, 1,000 miles, because you're kind of basing your information off of that initial anchor point. And this actually has a lot of real world implications other than trying to sell a house or a car, but also jury sentencing. What if, if you're a lawyer and you walk up and you say, this person deserves to go away for the maximum sentence. Well, you've just anchored maybe the jury and the judge on this maximum sentence, and now you will use that as your starting point rather than the defense might say my client deserves little jail time or no jail time, in which case now we're anchoring there. So this could change how long your jail sentence is. So the anchoring and adjustment heuristic really is going to be this idea that we are going to adjust to an anchor point. That anchor point is whatever kind of that first number we hear might be. Within the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, we have what we call the false consensus effect. It's basically the idea that we tend to overestimate others agreeing with us. And it's the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, more or less, because we anchor on our own beliefs as being the normal. And we might adjust for the fact that they're not who we are. So one study by Ross and colleagues looked at different types of people. And one type of people they looked at were vegetarians versus non-vegetarians. And they asked people, hey, what percentage of the population do you think is vegetarian? And they also asked people, what percentage of the population is of your religious beliefs? And what you see is that people overestimate their own beliefs. So vegetarians thought, would be more likely to say about 10% of the population of the world is vegetarian. Whereas a meat eater might be like, well, that's nothing like me. Probably just like 1%, Because most people don't do it because most people are like me. Religiously, we see the exact same thing. We think most people believe the same types of things that we do, but we're not always sure of that. So, this false consensus effect really has an important application to our judgments of other people, Do we think they know what we know? Do we recognize that they have knowledge we don't? Are we really anchoring on our own knowledge as being kind of the base level of knowledge when it's probably, we have specialized knowledge that maybe a lot of other people don't have. And so understanding that. Not only that, and we've talked about this one a little, is the idea of the spotlight effect, or the tendency that we think our actions are especially noticeable to others. So again, similar to the anchoring and adjusting, we think that whatever we're doing is kind of what is the most obvious or the clearest example of this. And so they did this by having people come to an experiment that they were told they actually came to a couple minutes late. And the idea was that these people had to sit in a room with a couple other people in the experiment. But before they jumped in there, they had to put on a T-shirt with this guy, maybe you've heard of him, Barry Manilow's face on it. So Gilovich and colleagues, Gilovich I've actually had the pleasure of meeting, a very nice guy. What he did was the experimenter handed the target a T-shirt with a large picture of the head and neck of Barry Manilow, a musician who's not terribly popular among college students, on the front. And with this, most students didn't know who this was. So what they did was they said, okay, so you're a minute or so late, and I'm going to need you to go ahead, throw this shirt on, and then go sit in the classroom and listen to the lecture. And go ahead and answer the questions about what you know after the lecture, or whatever it might be. But they also asked at the end, hey, how many people do you think would remember what was on that Barry Manilow shirt you wore? People thought about half of everyone in the room would notice that. And when they asked the other people in the room, just a little of over like 20% even noticed that this person was wearing a weird shirt. What does that suggest? It suggests that we're much more likely to anchor to our own experiences and think we are the norm, when most people are not exactly looking at us. They're probably more concerned about themselves. So recognizing that the spotlight effect is another kind of offshoot of the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. However, it is technically its own thing as well. Another thing we can talk about is what we call the base rate fallacy. The base rate fallacy is this idea that we tend to ignore information that is oftentimes statistical in nature based on maybe things that look better to us. So, what do you think is more likely that you're going to win win this grand prize, or maybe get cancer, for instance? People think, and they do, they try to think they are going to win the grand prize. They tend to believe that, hey, somebody has to win. It definitely could be me. The odds of this are like 1 in 2 million. So you really kind of run into this issue where people are focusing more on these dramatic or vivid case histories. And you can think about why some people might not want to take a cruise because they go, hey, I remember what happened on the Titanic, right? I don't want to die there. Well, you're focusing on a vivid case that happened once, but millions of boats travel without any instance every day. And this is going to be something that you can recognize as a very common bias that we all have, where we maybe overestimate or don't pay attention to specific rates of what we think is going to happen. Another bias we can talk about is the availability heuristic. And this is the idea that we often tend to base a judgment on how quickly or easily examples of that come to mind. And the reason we do that is because we think that things are easy to recall are more likely to be common or probable or correct, because it is what we're thinking about. So there is this classic task of which I will ask your guys' opinion. What do you think there are more of? Are there more words that start with the letter K or have the letter K as the third letter in them? The correct answer is the third letter. We can think of make, bake, take, Awkward is a word with K as the third letter. But if we think of words that start with K, those are easier to come to mind. Kite, Kyle, kill, king, other things like that. There's actually more words that have K as the third letter than K as the first letter, but they're harder to think of. So we maybe just shoot our minds into whatever makes more sense to us because they come to mind more easy. Yeah, so it's got to be the first letter. Well, again, you've fallen for the availability heuristic. In terms of some modern examples from the media, what percentage of NFL players do you think physically assault their domestic partners? Well, it's not as high as people think, but people say, wow, the NFL's got a huge problem with this because there are a couple high-profile cases. That does not mean every single person engages in this. A more real-life example, though, you might have done a group project before where you might have to estimate your contribution. Some people may not be honest about their contribution or might truly think they did more or less than they actually did because they're thinking about what's available to them. Another great example of this, and I guess it really is just kind of like a group project, is that looking at husband and wife couples, both the husband and the wife rated that they had more responsibility in household chores than one another in almost all the cases that they looked at. So what does that mean? Well, that means that both of them are, both the husband and wife are falling for the availability heuristic. They're thinking about the things that they know they do, but not necessarily about the things that their spouse does or does not do. If I only think about the fact that I take out the trash and take care of the car, maybe I'm forgetting that my wife dusts, and I don't place that into my kind of thinking about what that's going to do. So if I'm not thinking about that, then I might bias myself to believe that I'm the one who's done more. And one way we can actually do this is looking at this availability-ness as ease of retrieval, or what we can consider being the number of instances of a thing. So one way we can manipulate this is we can have participants recall different amounts of examples. So think about it this way. If I ask you to recall different times that you're assertive, it's going to be easier to recall fewer times. Right? If I ask you to recall 6 times, it's going to be a lot easier than recalling 12 examples of being assertive. So the reverse happens too. If you are asked to recall 6 times of being unassertive, you're going to think of those a lot easier than if you have to think of 12 times you were unassertive, because it's a lot more. So if we have participants recall, right, say 6 examples of being assertive and 12 examples of being unassertive, it's going to be easier for them to recall the 6. It's going to be harder for them to recall 12 examples of being unassertive. And when we ask people if they're assertive, well, when they only have to recall 6, they say they're more assertive. When people have to record 12 examples, they say they're less. The reverse is true, right? With the same measurement, with assertiveness, again, we see that with 6 instances, people think they're less assertive because it was easy to think up 6 instances of times that you weren't assertive. It's harder to think up 12 times that you are unassertive, that you are not assertive. So therefore, if you can't think of times where you're not assertive, you must imagine you're more assertive. So if number is bigger, it's going to be harder to remember those times. If it's easier, it's going to be the smaller number. Hopefully that makes sense. So that is the availability heuristic in a nutshell. It's going to be this idea that we are going to look at what comes to mind first and think that's probably the right answer. Again, that's a classic automatic thought process, right? We're not going through the controlled thought process of really digging deep into these. And another example of a heuristic we can talk about is the representative heuristic, or representativeness heuristic, excuse me. And this is used to estimate the extent of which something, a person or something, is representative of whatever the category is. So, am I representative of all professors? Are you representative of all students? Are any of us representative of things like our race, our gender, who we are as people? And that's a question that, right, if we think that everybody is different, which they are, it takes a lot of mental power to process that. So we just try to look for what is the most simple and clear thing. Right? And so one way we do that is we tend to ignore statistical information in favor of what we call stereotypical information. And again, what we mean by that is if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, I mean, it's probably a duck, right? Well, it doesn't have to be one, right? And so what we do is we ignore what we call the base rates. So we ignore what the actual percentage of things are, and we focus on whether these things fit into a category. So for instance, here, which of the following outcomes is more likely when tossing a coin 6 times? The coin landing heads, 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 then tails, 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 or the coin that lands tails, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails? Now, most of you might think it is this one. The second one, tails, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails. Now, it's less likely to be that one. Why? Because statistically, a coin toss is a 50-50. 1 tails, 2 tails, 3 tails, 4 tails, 1 head, 2 head. That's not 50-50. That's, I don't know, 6s. But the top one is 50-50. So what we see here is it's more likely to be this, but people don't like that because we don't expect heads to come up 3 times in a row. We think it's weird. We don't think it fits. In the same way that we would rather buy that first lottery ticket rather than the second one, there is no statistically different chance of the second one showing up than the first one. But it doesn't look random, and we don't think it's likely to happen. They're both as likely to happen. So oftentimes what we do is we neglect the actual rate that something is going to occur for what we think looks better. Which of these looks better? Well, the first one looks more random and looks like it's probably going to come up at some point before 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. They're both equally likely to come up. So recognize with base rate neglect, we might ignore some features because we think it fits into a category. We think it's representative of a category. Now, Kahneman and Tversky also looked at another bias. That's the last thing we're going to go over, and it's how we judge other people. So this is Linda here. Linda is 31 years old, she's single, and she's outspoken. The information that they tell about Linda includes that as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of social justice and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. This is back in the 80s, so we would consider that she probably would still be demonstrating if this woman, if we use the same example today. So then they asked participants, based on the information I've given you about Linda, which is more probable? Is it A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, that Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement? Well, the answer is something that most people get wrong. Now, we would think, right, that as a student who's deeply concerned about social justice, participating in these anti-nuclear demonstrations, being single, the word outspoken, this sounds like somebody who's a feminist, right? Somebody who's strongly advocating for their beliefs. But which is more likely? Okay, so in both of these, Linda is a bank teller. So let's think about this critically. Okay, so imagine I have a box here, and these are all the people who are bank tellers. Within that box, and it can't be other people, right? Out here, outside the box, people who are not bank tellers. Is every single bank teller feminist? No. So instantly, we have a lower number of people who are who are feminists than are bank tellers, because to have two things together is less likely than one. So what you see is that, right, inside this group might be this many people, right, who think that people are bank tellers and feminists. But in reality, 85% of people would say that she is a bank teller and a feminist. If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it ought to be a duck, right? Well, no, it doesn't have to be a duck. It's less likely for her to be a bank teller and a feminist than just a bank teller. In the same way, what is more likely, that I'm a professor or I'm a professor and I'm married, right? Well, one of those things includes some people who don't fit, right, a different category, so it has to be smaller. This is called the conjunction fallacy. We are conjoining two events, right? We're putting them together, and we think it's more likely that two separate events will happen than one, right? What is more likely, you getting into an accident and winning the lottery, or you winning the lottery? Both of those things are probably not likely, but we don't think of those two things as occurring together. But we do think of things that we, right, seem to be related, that she's a feminist and a bank teller. So this is an example of the conjunction fallacy. So that's a lot of these different heuristics, which we'll talk about in class in more detail. If you do have any questions, though, stop by office hours. Make sure you are checking up on your assignments and getting those done. You can stop by office hours if you can't make it. Go ahead and shoot me an email. We can find a time to chat. Otherwise, have a great one and enjoy your day.